After reading this module, you shall be able to know about the basic components and types of perception, learn about how cultural differences play a significant role in forming our perception of the external world, identify the different levels at which perception is colored by cultural influences. Perception as a fundamental process. Perception holds the position of the primary processes that individuals use along with other processes such as learning, memory, attention, and expectation in order to make sense of the world. The following module will make an attempt to familiarize you with the basic contents of perception and how cultural differences impact the process of perception. The APA defines perception as the processes that organize information in the sensory image and interpret it as having been produced by properties of objects or events in the external three-dimensional world. In general, perception refers to the process of organizing, identifying, and interpreting sensory information in order to represent and understand the environment of the individual. Perception involves selectively attending to certain stimuli in our environment, which traces its way to our nervous system through stimulation of our sense organs. Thus, the process of perception involves stimulus selection and its interpretation. Though perception is discussed at length in many Gestalt psychology books, the text will explore this process from cross-cultural perspective. This module gives a brief account of how our perception of the world is colored by the cultural milieu in which it is imbibed. Humans live in society of which culture is the foundation stone. The values, norms, and expectations existing in our society impact the way we implicitly represent the world. A great account of research literature exists that confirms the emphasis of culture on perception of individuals. Hence, the whole review will pivot around examining the similarities and differences that are observed in the process of perception across cultures. Variations in perception across cultures. Based on the aforementioned conception of perception, perception can be of different types: visual perception, sound perception, haptic perception, and taste perception. Social perception, which involves social cognition, person perception, perception of emotions, etc. The prominence of cultural context on perception can be seen under different contexts, which will be discussed in the following sections under the following subheadings, that are influence of culture on visual perception, influence of culture on auditory perception, influence of culture on cutaneous perception, and influence of culture on social perception. Variation in visual perception across cultures. Within the visual realm, vast studies had been done on color perception, pattern perceptions, illusions, picture perceptions. Interesting cross-cultural findings are observed within these categories. First, we'll be talking about illusions. Perceptions allows us to organize sensory information and form a comprehensible picture of the world. However, perception can at times also provide false interpretation of the world, which is commonly known as visual illusions. The most famous amongst these illusions are Mueller-Lyer illusion, Ponzo illusion, etc. The Mueller-Lyer illusion consists of line illusions wherein the arrow junction and the fork junction, despite having the same length, are perceived differently by the individuals involved. The Ponzo's illusion is a geometrical optical illusion in which we interpret the converging sides as receding from a distance. The two lines, which are actually equal in length, appear to be unequal. Several researches have been carried out which demonstrate that culture has an effect on visual illusions. Rivers did an experiment on English, rural Indian and New Guinean participants who were compared on Mueller-Lyer and horizontal-vertical illusion. Results showed that Indians and Guinean participants exhibited higher rate of horizontal-vertical illusion, while English participants displayed higher rate of Mueller-Lyer illusions. From various studies conducted by researchers have generated three hypotheses. Carpentered world hypothesis. People residing in an industrial urban environment live in rectangular patterned homes and streets, and they are predisposed to Mueller-Lyer and Sander parallelogram illusion. The foreshortening hypothesis. People residing in spacious, open and broad landscapes are vulnerable to horizontal-vertical illusions as compared to those people who inhabit in narrow and constricted spaces. Sophistication hypothesis. People who are exposed to pictorial material are at risk to display higher rate of visual illusions. Innumerable studies have confirmed these hypotheses. Segal et al. Have studied 5 forms of illusion on Westerners and non-Westerners and formed various observations. The kinds of illusions such as Mueller-Lyer illusion and Sander parallelogram illusion were shown to be high in Western sample, while they were shown to be low in non-Western sample, whereas the horizontal-vertical illusion was seen as low in the Western sample and seen as high in the non-Western sample. On the other hand, illusions like Ponzo illusions and adaptations of Ponzo illusions were high in the Western sample and low in the non-Western sample. Color perception. Color is a physical quality of the object. However, the process of color perception includes naming, remembering, categorizing the physical property in psychological terms. Historically, the work on color perception may be reported by Munsell in mid-19th century. However, the first report based on empirical investigations was reported by Magnus in 1880. He observed that the varieties of colors perceived across cultures are similar. However, few colors were not named in the cultures. Thus, consistent findings of innumerable researches suggest that though color is a physiological property perceived universally across various cultures, nevertheless there are linguistic variations observed across the cultures. For instance, in few cultures, color terminology does not indicate distinction in the perceptual apparatus of the group concerned. Pattern perception and figure perception. Studies indicate that schooling and familiarity via other means facilitate response time of the subjects within the cultures. Corollary findings were observed for the figure perception. In a study conducted by Hudson, school-going subjects were able to perceive third dimension, that is, depth in the figures, as against to those subjects that were illiterate and had no exposures of school. These findings are relevant in context as these studies specifically point out the cultures where schooling is not still a popular notion. Variations in auditory perception across cultures. Auditory perception refers to interpretation of sounds produced in physical environment by the brain. In earlier studies done by Renin and Wortley, it was observed that people in deserts, that are the non-industrialized countries, displayed better auditory acuity than the industrialized countries. For instance, the research reported by Kalahari Bushman exhibited better auditory acuity and showed low deterioration of hearing loss with increasing age. Variations in cutaneous perception across cultures. Cutaneous perception refers to the combination of responses from skin receptors evoked by mechanical and thermal stimuli, and occasionally chemical and painful events. In cross-cultural studies conducted on various cultures, Caucasians were observed to be taste blind for the substances like PTC, which is phenyl thiocarbamide or thiocarbamide group, that taste bitter to Africans, Americans and Indians. Another demonstration of cross-cultural studies performed between Oriental and European populations on comparing effects of alcohol is observed by Wolff. He found that Oriental inhabitants were more sensitive to after effect of alcoholic drinks than the European descent. In corollary studies conducted by Bertino, Bochum and Jen, Chinese rated sucrose at low concentration as more pleasant than the subjects in the US. Variations in social perception across cultures. A working definition of social perception refers to the study of how people form impressions of and make inferences about other people. Few recent studies in the area of social perception involve perception of interaction episodes. In order to understand the cultural influences on perception of interaction episodes, it becomes imperative that we understand what is meant by interaction episodes. Interaction episodes can be defined as the way we perceive and interpret our surrounding social environment, and social interaction routines is largely determined by the values and norms of our subjective culture. To support this notion, research was done by Forgas and Bond, who attempted to study the culture-specific social episodes in Hong Kong and Australia. Review of past research literature provided 4 dimensions, among which lies the differences in perception of interaction episodes, which are namely power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, collectivism, and masculinity. This research focused on 2 dimensions, namely power distance and individualism, collectivism. The Chinese participants were accepting of high power distance and authority differences, were collectivistic with solidarity and acceptance of immediate groups. The Australians, on the contrary, displayed low tolerance for inequality and authority, loosely knit social framework. The participants were shown 27 episodes and were given 3 tasks. The tasks were direct similarity ranking task, bipolar rating of episodes, composite individual difference questionnaire. It was found that the Chinese subjects reserved more positive evaluations for situations that were thought to be socially useful or valuable rather than intrinsically enjoyable. These dimensions did not reflect hedonistic relevance as common in the Western culture. Perception of power dynamics. Several researchers argue that power and power difference play an important role in cross-cultural perception. In a study by Hedges on cross-cultural perception and power dynamics across changing organizational and national contexts, which involved participants from 2 different countries, that is the Netherlands and Curacao, claim to support the influence of power dynamics on perception. Earlier, most of the literature categorized national cultures worldwide along small set of cultural dimensions, which provided little scope to incorporate the transient dimensions of culture. Earlier, culture was considered a homogeneous and coherent unit. However, modern researchers emphasize on the heterogeneous aspect of culture. Hedges attempted to study white European Dutch and African Curaçaoans alongside 2 changing contexts, the external national context and internal organizational context. This required the study to be carried out in 2 organizations, namely the Internal Revenue System and Police, separately in Netherlands and Curaçao. It was found that in Netherlands, Curaçaoans were considered as slow, lacking in punctuality, initiative and working speed by their Dutch colleagues. However, Higher in the organization, Dutch perceived the cooperation as better. On the contrary, Curaçaoans considered Dutch as rude and inflexible. In the police, Dutch made distinction between their Curaçaoan colleagues and other co-commons, with the external perception being mostly negative. They were considered as criminals and media supported such beliefs. Curaçaoans in the police focused more on discrimination and exclusion. Thus, it is evident from the research study that power dynamics do play an important role in perception. Person perception. In our day-to-day interactions with other people, the glasses embedded in cultural milieu through which we perceive the world often color our judgments regarding it. Several models have been put forth to understand how culture impacts our perception of other people. Person perception model, which states that perception consists of initial dispositional attribution stage followed by situational correction stage, in which the information about situational constraints is used to adjust the initial inferences. The model also claims that the situational corrections depend heavily on cognitive load, whereas initial dispositional inference is relatively automatic. The spontaneous default inference model suggests that initial inferences are not always dispositional. Rather, culture may alter the type of initial inference through the process of socialization and practice. Automatized situational correction model suggests that situational correction is not always effortful. Noyles et al. Provided the evidence for automaticity amongst East Asians in correcting for situational influences on behavior. It was found that non-Westerners make initial dispositional inference as Westerners but perform situational corrections to the same degree. It was suggested that due to the effect of collectivistic culture, non-Westerners found situational correction rather effortless than the Westerners. Clinical perception. From the previous sections, it is quite evident that culture plays a significant role in styling our perception of other people and the external environment. Its effects being so strong that even the clinical settings are also not barred from it. Researchers show that a therapist's cultural background essentially gets reflected in his or her perception about the client. A study was carried on white and Chinese American therapists by REPAC. There were certain similarities and differences found in the participants of the two cultures. It was seen that both the cultures perceived normality in similar terms. It was, however, found that there lie certain differences in the perception of clients solely pertaining to culture factors. The reason that white and Chinese American therapists have essentially the same notion as to what constitutes a normal individual is because they have received similar training. The significant difference lays mainly in the rating of clients. White therapists tended to rate Chinese clients as more depressed and possessed less social poise and interpersonal capacity. The Chinese American therapists, on the other hand, judged the white clients to show more pathology than the white therapists. The differences were interpreted in the term of the personal biases along with preconceived notions about the world in general in the study. Perception of emotions. How we perceive the emotions of other people is also colored by cultural influences. There has been found universal consensus in judgment of emotions such as anger, fear, disgust, happiness, sadness, etc. However, there exist cultural differences in their judgment, particularly when rating intensity. Research has demonstrated that in collectivistic cultures with acceptance of high power distance, communication of negative emotions is less tolerated as it hinders with the solidarity of social groups, whereas In the individualistic cultures with lower acceptance of power distance hierarchy, such communication is much more tolerated as it fosters individuality. It has also been found that cultures high on uncertainty avoidance, a dimension of Hoff's feat, as previously mentioned, have a higher tendency to experience high anxiety and fear. Matsumoto and Ekman's study of American-Japanese differences in the perception of emotional intensity shows that strong, consistent cultural differences for all emotions except disgust. Perception of boundaries in relationships. A thorough review of research literature shows that cultural differences also influence our perception of boundaries, especially in a cultural setting, and as to what violates these boundaries. Study by Ghulam et al. Attempted to understand the perception of boundaries and cultural differences in Qatar. There are certain differences and similarities associated. Certain behaviors are considered unacceptable under any circumstances, like overtly sexual behavior. However, the perceptions of relatively less serious unacceptable behaviors are different with respect to cultural sensitivities. Thus, these variations in perceptions highlight the role of culture in bringing variations in the perception of an individual. Summary: perception allows us to organize sensory information and form a comprehensible picture of the world. However, perception can at times also provide false interpretation of the world, which is commonly known as visual illusions. In order to understand the cultural influences on perception of interaction episodes, it becomes imperative that we understand what is meant by interaction episodes. Interaction episodes can be defined as the way we perceive and interpret our surrounding social environment, and social routines is largely determined by the values and norms of our subjective culture. Several researchers argue that power and power difference play an important role in cross-cultural perception. In a study by Hedges on cross-cultural perception and power dynamics across changing organizational and national contexts, which involved participants from two different countries, that is the Netherlands and Curacao, claimed to support the influence of power dynamics on perception. Research has demonstrated that in collectivistic cultures with acceptance of high power difference, communication of negative emotions is less tolerated as it hinders with the solidarity of social groups, whereas in individualistic cultures with lower acceptance of power distance hierarchy, such communication is much more tolerated as it fosters individuality. It is quite evident that culture plays a significant role in styling our perception of other people and the external environment. These variations in perceptions highlight the role of culture in bringing variations in the perception of an individual.